I think my view on the trans issue um, uh, is basically quite a simple one, and it's based quite simply on ideas like kindness and tolerance, and the idea that people should be treated as they wish to be treated. And to put it, as simply as this, um, Nick, if you were to come into my home tomorrow, wearing female clothes and saying you wished in future to be called Nicola, in future I would call you Nicola and treat you as female because that's what you want, and it's polite, and kind and friendly to treat people the way they wish to be treated. And my view of the matter really is no more profound and no more philosophical than that. That in life we should always behave towards other people as we would wish other people to behave towards us in similar circumstances. And I have no difficulty with people adopting whatever gender role they wish to adopt. I think we've all met in our lifetimes. We've all met people of whose gender we felt slightly unsure. Whether people who it's not immediately obvious to us whether they're male or female, and the answer is that we accept them as they present themselves. I've never ever felt the need to demand to inspect somebody's genitals in order to know how to treat them, and I think that's perfectly right. And I think this kind of what I would describe as an unhealthy interest in other people's genitalia it is really fairly strange, and I honestly don't get it. I don't get the whole basis of hostility to trans people is something that passes me by entirely.
It's interesting you say hostility to trans people. Now, I'm aware of some of the debates that you've been involved in online. Forgive me if I'm traducing you here, but I think it is fair to say that you consider the debate as it's taking place in Scotland somewhat toxic, and that you're a member of the Alba Party, which is a position which I think you'd rather we kind of weren't so focused on. If that's
I think one of the remarkable things about the entire trans debate is that people on both sides, and I really do mean people on both sides. I'm not being, falsely. I'm not being falsely fair or trying. I think people who have the same views as me and people who have the opposite view, on both sides, there are people who are profoundly hostile to people who have the other view, which is something I don't understand at all, because on almost all subjects of political debate, it ought to be perfectly possible to disagree without being unfriendly to each other. I have to confess, I have friends who are unionists, and I have members of my family, not my immediate family, but I have relatives who are unionists. I don't get angry with them or not speak to them because of that. I do try and divert them occasionally, but the trans debate seems to have this kind of extra needle to it, where people on both sides get furious at people for having the other view, and people routinely mischaracterize the view of the other side, and put up Aunt Sally's and caricature the opposing view as the immediate sort of go-to in debate. And I find that very hard to understand. But having said that, the people who are very interested in the debate get absolutely unreasonable and furious about it on both sides. But on the other hand, the number of people who are very interested in the debate is extremely small. And it doesn't have electoral salience. It really doesn't. If you ask people what are their list of concerns, they're the obvious things. They're the NHS, their inflation, their unemployment. At the moment, there's a war in Ukraine. Some people are concerned about nuclear weapons on the monarchy and whatever. And trans issues, really don't appear on the list, or if they did, they appear very, very far down as issue number 42 or something. And I think the Alpha Party have done to death the notion that campaigning on the issue wins you votes. I think they have. I think they have comprehensively proven at 2 elections that no matter how strongly you feel about the subject, campaigning on it isn't going to win an election or bring any electoral advantage. Because although the people who are interested in it, including so many members of the party, feel extremely strongly about it, your average punter doesn't. And it's not something they think about at all. And it really isn't a sensible thing to make a major part of your electoral platform.
And yet it has the debate, I don't mean Alapa's position in particular, but the debate in general. A number of political parties have taken very strong stances on one side or the other. I'm mindful of what happened to Andy Whiteman, and when he voted against he voted with the government motion with his own party whip when the government chose to vote against their own motion, spoke out about his misgivings about the way in which the dialogue was conducted in the Green Party. And he was hounded, reviled by many Green Party colleagues who'd previously, been very happy to have him making their case in Parliament. Yeah,
that's true, and was a terrible thing, because Andy Whiteman is, I don't agree with him on absolutely every subject, but and I should say I thought his role on the Salmons Committee wasn't, he didn't cover himself in glory. But in general, he is one of the better and more able people in Scottish politics, and certainly he was probably the most able member of the Green Party. And I think the idea that people cannot hold a contrary view on the issue of how society treats trans people without people can't hold a contrary view without being drummed out of a party or whatever is just crazy. But that's a good example of it. I myself attract a very great deal of criticism from people on the trans rights side of the debate for being insufficiently absolutist. The main sort of trans campaigning bodies don't accept me as being on their side at all, even though I sort of 90% am. Because you're not allowed to be 90% anything. You have to be 100%, one side or the other. And on almost any issue, when you reach that stage, sense has gone out the window. You just have 2 opposing camps shouting at each other.
It strikes me, and a wee bit of background, Craig. I basically got cancelled from a job that I loved and was quite good at, because I had spoken out about the issue years previously on my personal social media, and it was, it was dragged up, and I was made a persona non grata, the person to walk the plank, basically. And I remember talking to a colleague who was much more level-headed, and his view was that obviously at some stage there needs to be some kind of societal synthesis. There needs to be some place where there is an armistice line that perhaps 2 entrenched camps don't agree with, but that the society can work with. And obviously we're really not reaching that point. There's this as you say, you're 90% with one view, and you're not acceptable to that camp.
Yeah. I mean, if I might perhaps give a practical example. Last week, the debate focused on a cyclist. I can't remember their name.
Yeah, I recall.
Yeah, who is a trans woman, and it became very heated on the subject of that person. My view would be this: that person feels themselves to be female and wishes to be treated as female, and I have no difficulty at all with the notion of calling her she and her, and addressing her as female and treating her as female in every way. But on the other hand, it seems to be also obvious that people who have gone through puberty as male and have the physical advantages in the context of elite sport that brings ought not to compete in elite sport. The notion that male athletes should simply be able to transition into women's elite sport seems to me plainly unfair on people who have developed as female with less muscle mass and that kind of thing. It makes no sense. So if there is still going to be women's competitive sport, all sports not to become mixed gender, then it seems to be fairly obvious that ordinarily trans women ought not compete in elite sport, and I don't really see why that's difficult. But it doesn't mean that the person can't be treated as, elite sport is such a tiny percentage of the population. It really is. I think a great deal more sport should be mixed gender anyway, frankly, at the non-elite level. At the non-elite level, there's no reason for a great deal of sport to be single gender always. My first wife, I recall, could always beat me at squash and tennis. But elite sport is such an exceptional circumstance in life. The vast majority of us would never be able to play elite sport, male or female, because we don't have the ability to do it. It affects a tiny percentage of the population, and it seems to me that the common sense thing there is that trans women don't compete as women in elite sport. But that doesn't mean they can't be treated as female in every other aspect of their life. And that, if you like, is the kind of compromise that is missing from the debate. That's where other people saying that person is not a woman, they can never be a woman, they are a man, there's no such thing as a trans woman. Or no, they must be accepted totally as a woman, and any male must be able to declare they're female and immediately compete as a female in sport. Both those positions are mad to me, frankly.
Well, I think that touches on where I was going to go with my next comment, because obviously the ethics of the debate are separate from the different legislative frameworks of how that debate manifests itself in different countries. So in the UK, we have the 2010 Equalities Act, and it defines protected characteristics. And obviously one of those protected characteristics is gender reassignment, which the legislation is informed by the 2004 Gender Recognition Act, which obviously in Scotland, the government means to change. But one of the concerns that people have is if you change that Gender Recognition Act, you undermine the basis of that other piece of legislation, the 2010 Equalities Act, which has all these far-reaching implications. And I'm more familiar with it in a trade union context, because if you want to prove that someone's being victimized, you have to prove that they are first a protected characteristic. So if you change with the nature of those protected characteristics, you necessarily impact on things like trade union law. So I don't know if do you have any comments on that at all?
Well, I think if it did require changes in the Equalities Act, then changes can be made to the Equalities Act. You know, I don't see that as an insuperable problem. I think that trans women should be entitled to the protections of women, and I think trans women are, in almost all circumstances, more vulnerable in society than other women. It doesn't seem to me the Equalities Act is held up as a great totem that that cannot be altered or changed as though it were fundamental constitutional documents. It's not. It's just another piece of parliamentary legislation which can be changed, and it doesn't really say what people claim it says in many ways. You know, it doesn't talk of a right to single-sex spaces, for example. Well, what it says is that desegregation is the norm, and that then it lists certain exclusions where different treatment of male and female is permissible. But that really is much less strong, but than an affirmation of a right to single-sex spaces, for example. If you actually read the Equalities Act, it's much more about equality than it is about exclusion and segregation. Can I come on to something which anybody I haven't annoyed already is going to get very annoyed when I say this? I find that some of the aspects taken by the academic, in particular, proponents of modern feminism, I find them peculiar and difficult to go along with. When I was a young man, which is very long ago, feminism was all about equality. It was about equality of treatment, equality of opportunity for male and female. It was initially about, desegregating places, women being allowed to enter places that had been reserved to men, about common space. And obviously, things like equality of opportunity and equal pay, it's all very well achieving them in legislation, but that's very difficult to achieve in practice when, no matter what legislation we have, female pay lags behind male pay, and glass ceilings stop women from getting as far with equality. No, plainly, equality of opportunity hasn't really come to pass when you look at senior levels of management in almost everything around the country. So affirmative action is necessary, but it wasn't about excluding males from female spaces, and that is increasingly, and particularly in the trans debate, that is sometimes the emphasis. And let me develop that a bit further. I campaigned, when I left the Foreign Office, I left them over the issue of torture and extraordinary rendition and the war on terror, and injustices being done, particularly to the Muslim community in the UK, in the name of a war on terror. And I spoke to an awful lot of Muslim audiences, particularly in Blackburn, in Bradford, and other cities in the north of England. And very often the default setting, if you like, the default setting of the organizers was to have segregation in the audience, to have either the women upstairs and the men downstairs, or have the women on the left-hand side, the men on the right-hand side, and a blanket in between them. And I always refused to speak to segregated audiences. I always said, I will happily speak to your meeting, but I'm sorry, I don't do segregation. I'm not going to speak to a segregated audience. Because segregation, in my view, is a bad thing.
Well,
and then but let me come. Then I see motions being put forward to Aleppo conference, which talk not only of women's right to self-spaces, and of course at places like centres for the treatment of domestic violence.
That's where I was going to go next, Greg.
Yeah, of course, in unusual and unique unusual circumstances like that, there can be. But I see motions calling for women's right to separate education. And what? Education. We haven't even managed to desegregate. Well, we haven't even managed to stop segregation of Catholics and Protestants in education in Scotland. Something we need to do urgently, and we certainly. Mad. If you speak to, and I have actually spoken to. Are we okay on internet? Because
yeah, we lost you. You made the point with Catholics and Protestants, and then
yeah,
okay.
Yeah, no, I mean we certainly didn't ought to be increasing segregation in education, for example, on between the sexes.
Mm-hmm.
I've if you actually, and it occurred to me, and this infuriates people when I say it, if you actually go and talk to the Taliban. And I have actually talked to the Taliban. Mm-hmm. They will tell you that women should be sexually educated. What do they really think? What they will say to you, the intellectual leaders of the Taliban, is that women need to be educated separately from men for their own protection. Mm-hmm. It's to protect them from a male gaze. It's to protect them from male sexuality. Is to allow them the freedom to speak out without being intimidated by having men in the room. And that really is what the Taliban will tell you in justifying separate female education, mm-hmm. Which is exactly the kind of thing that I keep hearing as reasons given for excluding trans people. I really think a lot of this needs to be rethought. I don't like segregation of human beings as a general principle, and it should only be done where necessary. And the furious campaigning for the right to segregation is something which I am not emotionally or intellectually in sympathy with. Mm-hmm. And I think there needs to be a discussion around that as well.
Well, let's go back there a second, Craig, because obviously, we discussed the Equalities Act, and the way I've always seen these things, because I'm a bloke, I can give it good licks about feminism and whatever, but it's not my role. But I do concede that the right of people to self-organise, and a good example is what's happening in the women's aid and rape crisis movement. You have the Scottish movement taking quite a different position from the English movement, and the Scottish movement, it's fair to say, is at loggerheads, and some of that is about the finance that comes from institutions like the Scottish government who have a particular view. But as you said, you can see the point where battered women, women fleeing domestic violence, may have very just reason to have single sex spaces for whatever, but and you draw a distinction from that, from a general segregation or segregation as a goal. But I kind of want to tease that one out because from a pure self-ID perspective, what you said there is kind of anathema. That we have to accept that a person's gender presentation it is the same, and that's I think the nub of what a lot of people are concerned about in terms of the undermining of same-sex protections in the Equalities Act.
I think before we come on to that bit, to go back to where is segregation acceptable and where is not where's segregation not acceptable? I think in, as you say, a refuge for battered women, I think segregation is acceptable for reasons which are just too obvious to discuss. I don't think in a political meeting it is. If I were to hold a meeting about the future of welfare policy in Scotland and say only men can attend, people would rightly be outraged. And I actually do not accept that because of the history of the patriarchy or whatever other reason is advanced, that it's fine to have meetings on welfare, on the future of the welfare system in Scotland from which men are excluded. I actually, and I think that people, as you know, I'm never scared to say what I think and be attacked.
No,
and I think people are intimidated by, I think people have been, because there's so much obvious right on the side of the victims as a class or as a sex have been the victims of great injustice historically. I think people have been scared to sometimes say, whoa, that's going too far. No, sorry, you can't have totally separate political meetings from which one sector is excluded. You can't. And I think in general terms, I think life would be better if people were prepared on occasion to say that. To come back to your specific points, I think in general, I don't know. It's a tricky question. If you take somebody like Chelsea Manning, for example, whose identification as female, I think undoubtedly is genuine and heartfelt, and who believes themselves to be female and is certainly no threat to anyone, and is a very vulnerable human being in many ways. I think if Chelsea were battered, then Chelsea should be looked after in a space for women. And I don't think any reasonable person could claim that they felt Chelsea Manning was a threat, but because Chelsea Manning isn't. The trouble is,
I think if I could interject, if I could just briefly interject, I think that the difficulty is with legislation is that it's a hard line. If we say that we have self-identification, yeah, there are trans women who are absolutely no threat at all. But if you look at the patterns of offending behaviour, serial rapists, paedophiles, all sorts of exploitative people, the vast majority of them are male. And when you create a system that is an honour system, then you create the space where
but that again,
exploitation can happen.
But that, I think, that seems to me not difficult at all. It seems to me that the legislation should say that self-ID should be the norm, but that does not apply to people with a history of sexual offence against women or children. That seems to me extremely bitter. That's one of the things I don't understand about this entire debate.
Are you confident that it does at the moment?
A sort of perfectly workable and sensible compromise.
Are you confident that those safeguards are in place?
No, I'm not. But I think they should be. And again, this is where, do I think, I'll come on to say something else in a moment, but do I think somebody with a history of sexual offences against women should be able simply to self-ID as female? No, of course I don't. Again, I think people who do think that are taking an extreme and peculiar position, which is very hard to justify. it seems to me that people with a history of sexual offence should go through a process to verify, if you like, the genuineness of their transition, and that seems to me entirely reasonable. But that's not the vast majority of trans people.
No,
and
well, this is the interesting intersect between, as I say, two very entrenched camps, and also the sort of wider social interest in that. You know, the number of creepy men out there far outweigh the number of trans women. It's just a sheer volume of population. So this is, I think, for me at least, the nub of the question of how do you provide safeguards while also recognizing the rights of a particular group, particularly when all these other intersecting equalities questions are in play.
Yeah, well, I agree, and I don't think it's difficult. I think people are innocent until proven guilty. I think people who have a history of sexual offence should be treated as sexual offenders, and in various walks of life should suffer the consequences of that in terms of their societal interactions. And one of those consequences should be they didn't ought to simply be allowed to transition gender as part of self-ID. That again seems to me perfectly reasonable. It doesn't seem to me, but I think that before anyone has committed a sexual offence, they should not be treated as a sexual offender or considered likely to be a sexual offender. And that's one of the things to which I do fundamentally object in the debate, that people, that very often that's people's first go-to when they're discussing. And trans people are characterized as rapists and sexual perverts, which, which is grossly unfair, and one of the reasons why the debate becomes so heated. But I don't see any reason at all why self-ID cannot be the general rule, and there should be rare exceptions. And those exceptions, to me, are obvious. They are elite sport. They are people with a history of sexual offence. And these are not, fortunately, these are not things which affect the large majority of people in society.
So I'm aware that we're running out of time, Craig, and I'm sure you have stuff to do, and I'd love to talk to you under different circumstances rather than an interview.
I have to have a Lagavulin. That's all.
So if you had a closing remark, for the last minute or so.
Yeah, I think I come back to the idea that people have the right to be treated as they wish to be treated, and the question of whether I think somebody looks male or looks female or what their specific genitalia are shouldn't arise, and people shouldn't suffer penalty for it unless they've actually done something wrong, and people shouldn't be presumed to be offenders when they're not offenders. And that the large majority of trans people, but trans people both ways, are rather vulnerable in society and should be treated with as much kindness as we can muster. And that's my basic position, comes from one of simply tolerance and a certain libertarianism. And I do think, with goodwill on both sides, where self-ID stops and where intervention by the state starts is a question which can be ironed out,